Tonight on KQED Newsroom, President Trump visits California, raising millions for his re-election bid and setting up a fight with the Golden State over clean air standards. Also, Governor Gavin Newsom orders a crackdown on youth vaping, as dozens in the state have fallen ill and 2 have died from vaping. Plus, a poignant and powerful look into the struggles and triumphs of California opera singers who are transgender. Good evening and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Mina Kim. We begin tonight with President Trump's visit to California earlier this week. On Tuesday, President Trump kicked off 2 days of fundraisers in California. He met with wealthy donors in the Bay Area and Southern California to raise millions for his re-election bid and the Republican National Committee. But he also raised the ire of top state officials by announcing that his administration would revoke California's ability to set its own tougher fuel emission standards. Since 1970, the EPA has granted California a waiver to enforce aggressive air pollution standards that are today followed by 13 other states. Governor Gavin Newsom threatened legal action and called the move, quote, a continuation of a political vendetta against California. With us now is Senior Research Fellow from Stanford University, Michael Wara. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Thanks for having me on.
So President Trump, he doesn't come to California very often, and what does he do while he's here? He revokes California's long-standing authority to determine its own fuel emissions standards. And I think the big question coming out of this is, can he do this, and how is he going to do this?
Well, I think it's a legally risky strategy. But, and there are pieces of it, pieces of what the Trump administration proposed that are unlikely to actually result in enforceable regulations, and there are pieces of it where he could actually change what California is and is not allowed to do.
So talk about the rationale from the Trump administration about why this is needed, and also talk about the revocation. I think you're talking about those 2 parts of it.
That's right. So since the advent of the Clean Air Act, because California has much more challenging air pollution problems than almost any other state in the country, we've had special authority to regulate emissions from cars and trucks. And we've used that authority time after time, actually I think more than 100 times, to set more stringent rules about the air pollution coming out of tailpipes. About 10 years ago, we started to expand that authority to include greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted by cars and trucks. And one thing that Trump is doing is saying that the decision to allow that was a misinterpretation of the Clean Air Act. I think there's going to be a big fight in the courts about whether that reinterpretation of the law is permissible or not. And I think we'll have to see how it turns out. However, the other piece of what Trump is doing is revoking our current permission to have a stricter standard. We've set standards actually twice to limit tailpipe CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and Trump has said that the current permit that California has essentially to set its own rules for carbon dioxide has been revoked. And the interesting question here is that there's no permission to revoke this kind of a special waiver in the Clean Air Act. So there's no controlling law, and there's a lot of reliance. There's the state and auto manufacturers have kind of assumed that the rules of the road are the rules of the road, and they've invested accordingly. And 13 other states have also relied on the standard that California set. So that's a much more difficult case for the administration to make, and I think it's a much riskier legal strategy.
And talk about that reliance. I mean, we have some sense of it because 4 big automakers signed on to California's tougher fuel emission standards. So to some extent, you've got massive industry that's relying on this, and as you said, several other governments in other parts of the nation.
That's right. So industry, the auto industry has to plan years in advance for new vehicles and for the mix of products that they intend to produce. And they have to design them, and then they have to build the factories to build them and train and hire and train the people that are going to do that. It is a very long-term product cycle. And they need stable advance notice of what the rules are going to be for air pollution. And so what Trump is doing what President Trump is doing is essentially kind of throwing that up into the air right now. And so the auto industry is actually not supportive of the steps that the administration is taking. That's a big change from a few years ago when the industry was trying to negotiate for a weakening of the standards. If the industry has notice, they might have a different view of what's happening here, but they're very much opposed to kind of ripping up the permit. The states rely on the assumed level of pollution coming out of cars so that they can set the rules for other types of pollution sources, because they need to achieve healthy air under the Clean Air Act. And so what this also does is upset the planning that states have done to achieve air quality that's acceptable under the law.
So given all of this, it just raises the question of why. Why is the Trump administration doing this? They're claiming that it will create safer cars and that it will spur job growth, but those two assertions have been challenged, for lack of a better word. And so what do you think is motivating this move by the administration and motivating them to do it now?
Well, I think it is striking that whenever the companies being regulated by the government say, we like the regulations, don't change them, and the government is changing them anyway, you have to look for another reason. And I think that the reality is that the transformation in the auto sector that's occurring, the move toward electrification, is scaring big oil. And it is a frightening prospect for oil companies. And the reasonable conclusion is that what's happening with fuel economy standards has much more to do with protecting the interests of companies that drill and produce oil and refine it into gasoline than it does with protecting the interests of the car manufacturers. In terms of the claims about jobs, most major auto manufacturers need to produce a product they can sell everywhere in the world in order to be competitive and profitable. The reality is that everywhere else in the world, all the major markets have fuel economy standards that are more stringent than the United States. And so this actually complicates the strategies for most auto manufacturers because they have to figure out how to sell inefficient cars in the US while they also produce cars for sale in Europe and China that are much more fuel efficient.
So even though the political motivation may be, hey, I'm standing up for you, oil industry, there are real and felt consequences from taking this action of revoking the waiver, is there not? I mean, for example, there were other car companies that were going to sign on to California's tougher standards. Maybe they're rethinking that now. I mean, what kind of impact do you think this could have both on our greenhouse gas emissions and also on air pollution in California?
Well, I think there's no question that the standards that the Obama administration negotiated with industry and that the Air Resources Board negotiated with industry are the most important step we've taken in the United States to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They're also saving consumers money. And the interesting coincidence of the attacks in Saudi Arabia, which caused a spike in global oil prices, from which the United States is not shielded and consumers in the United States are not shielded with this action, I think is really striking. We are energy independent to the degree that we use less oil, not to the degree that we produce more in the unconventional fields. So I think the big impacts are going to be higher greenhouse gas emissions in the US and also a struggle on the part of consumers to afford fuel for their vehicles.
We'll have to leave it there. Michael Wara, thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Earlier this week, state health officials confirmed that a man in Tulare County has died from complications linked to the use of e-cigarettes. There are now 2 deaths and more than 80 potential cases of lung disease linked to vaping in California. Nationwide, hundreds of cases of illness linked to the use of e-cigarettes and vaping products have been reported in 38 states, according to the CDC. Meanwhile, on Monday, Governor Gavin Newsom ordered a crackdown on illicit vaping products in the state and a marketing campaign to curb the use of e-cigarettes e-cigarettes by teens. Joining me now to talk about this is KQED health reporter Laura Clivens and Dr. Erica Pon, interim health officer for the Alameda County Public Health Department. So glad to have both of you here with us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
And Laura Clivens, I'd like to start with you. The Tulare County man who died, his death was confirmed just this week. What can you tell us about him?
Okay, so he was over 40 years old and he had had a history of vaping, and he was being treated for lung illness for the past several weeks. And he was the second person to die in California.
And of the more than 80 cases of lung damage in California, Dr. Pon, what can you tell us about the cases in Alameda County? I understand that there were 4 cases of lung illness in Alameda County. Were there similarities among those cases?
Yes, well, across the state and the country, we're using some criteria to define what we're calling cases. So all of them were hospitalized, all of them have abnormalities on their chest x-rays, and some of them have needed some kind of support, whether it's oxygen or extra pressure, and in extreme cases, they've been intubated and in the intensive care unit. They definitely have all had some use of vaping devices within the last 90 days, and most of the cases have reported either using THC or CBD, cannabidiol, or tetrahydrocannabidiol oils in those devices.
That's that ingredient in marijuana that makes you high, essentially.
Exactly.
So then are they homing in on THC products as a substance that's causing these things? I know it's been very hard to isolate a cause.
It's been very hard, and I think there's still no conclusions within the state or nationwide. There have been periodic conference calls actually across the nation, talking to pulmonologists and other clinicians across the country, trying to continue to characterize what are the commonalities, what are the common exposures, but we're all still stumped and trying to do our best to characterize the illness, and also trying to get those vaping cartridges of some of the cases and trying to do different testing, but there still hasn't been one thing that's come as a theme across all of the different cases.
Not even vitamin E oil, right? That's something we were hearing a lot about earlier.
I think that has been reported in some of the cases, but again, it hasn't necessarily been seen in every single one.
The state took some action this week, Laura Clivens. What can you tell us about Governor Gavin Newsom's executive order?
Yeah, so he outlined a few different things. He wants to put at least $20 million into a campaign, an awareness campaign targeted largely at youth. So it'll have digital tools and online media, social media tools. He's hoping to crack down on counterfeit vaping devices and put warnings in stores and on advertisements for the products. He also said that he personally would love to go further and ban all flavored e-cigarettes from the state, but that's not in his authority to do so.
Are flavored vapes more dangerous than tobacco or THC vapes without those flavors? Or are public health advocates using this moment, Erica Pon, would you say, when there is a great deal of public concern about e-cigarettes, to push for banning flavored vapes?
I think the issue we're trying to address with flavored is that that is a way to lure children, right? To get children addicted early on. We have seen that in Alameda County, in one of our recent surveys, that over 87% of youth tobacco smokers had used a flavored tobacco product. They have products now that have mango, gummy bear flavors, and this is again a way to get our youth addicted early on and be a lifetime of addiction. So it's not necessarily that the flavors themselves are considered to be toxic, but that it's a way that we're really trying to attract our youth early.
And Laura Clivens, you've talked with teens who vape. Is it the flavors that are the lure? What other forces are there that you think are influencing or encouraging teens to try this?
I think it's like many things that people are interested when they're teenagers. It's a way to rebel, but also it's fairly addictive. So I've spoken to some teenagers who say, I started it because I believed it was healthier, because they've heard some things about it's a healthier alternative to traditional cigarettes. It's still an addictive product that has nicotine in it, and so some of them have become addicted more easily than they thought they could.
It's one of the other things that really struck me in your survey, Erica Pon, was the fact that 70% of teens were saying that they were getting e-cigarettes in stores even though they can't buy them till they're 21. So what did that tell you about how to approach a solution?
There's a few different things we need to do, right? I think what we're really seeing as well in our concerns in public health is we had done a great job getting tobacco control had really reduced the use of traditional cigarettes over time. Only 1 in 20 youth have actually used traditional cigarettes, but yet 1 in 4 have actually vaped. So I think there are definitely issues of access, but again, I think also just increasing understanding that this is just as harmful and that we still don't know a lot, as shown by all these serious cases that we don't know what toxins could be in these products and what is causing the more serious illness, much less the long-term effects that we're still waiting to see.
Well, today we heard that Walmart was going to stop selling e-cigarettes. How big of a move is this from a public health standpoint? Do you think other retailers will follow suit?
I think it's a great move, is considering the reach of Walmart, and I think anything we can do to decrease access. So, and as you just mentioned, since so many youth can get it in regular stores, anything we can do to decrease access and decrease appeal to youth will help us get our rates down.
Why are these cases showing up now? I mean, people have been using e-cigarettes for years, so why suddenly this surge of cases of lung damage and death?
That's a great question that we're all scratching our heads together and trying to figure out. I do think even as we see just in the last few months and the number of cases that are being reported are increasing, some of them the people, both youth who are smoking and or their parents and clinicians are just now kind of putting 2 and 2 together. Some of our first cases reported in Alameda County had been ill in the hospital over a month ago, but then once people were hearing the news and putting 2 and 2 together, really thinking, so this may have been going on longer and just not reported in the same way. Public health just made this reportable within the last couple months, so we're slowly learning more. And there may indeed be some new toxin or contaminant out there that we haven't yet identified that is causing the most serious illnesses.
In meantime, Laura, public health officials, the CDC, they're calling this an ongoing epidemic. Does that mean that we're going to still see a lot more cases of this and even more deaths?
Yeah, it probably does. The CDC had said that she anticipates more deaths because there are people who are grappling with this illness right now who might actually still die. And so that total right now is about 8 people around the country, and it could increase.
And the 4 cases that I mentioned that have been reported by Alameda County, is that the latest number, Erica Pon?
That is the latest number.
It is. So
yes. But again, I do think this is underreported. I think we are all just scratching the surface of people coming in who might be treated for a pneumonia, they get treated with antibiotics, and then they're not getting better. And there's probably a spectrum of illness that we're still not sure of yet.
So for those who vape, who are understandably concerned, what would you recommend that they do? What symptoms should they be on the lookout for?
As far as symptoms, I would say any kind of difficulty breathing, shortness of breath. A lot of people have actually presented with some more chronic symptoms, a lot of tiredness. I've even heard of a few cases of weight loss over a few weeks or months, and the spectrum has been some people with symptoms only for a few days versus weeks or months. So again, it's a spectrum, and I think really our advice is we don't know what's causing this right now, and if you can stop vaping, we would stop now and certainly not start now. We really want people to avoid it.
Dr. Pon, Dr. Erica Pon, Laura Clivens, thank you both.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Making it as an opera singer is tough enough as it is, but try making it as an opera singer who also happens to be transgender. Elliot Franks, Lucia Lucas, and Brianna Sinclair are classical vocalists blazing new trails in the world of opera. A new KQED radio documentary reveals their courageous quest to find a voice and acceptance in an industry that's been described as gendered and rigid. Joining me now is the producer of the documentary, KQED Arts and Culture reporter Chloe Veltman, and transgender opera singer Brianna Sinclair. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Brianna, in 2015, you became the first transgender vocalist to sing the national anthem at an Oakland A's game. Let's hear a little bit of that first.
Brianna is in her early 30s and starting to hit her stride as a singer. In 2015, she became the first trans vocalist to sing the national anthem at a professional sports event.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?
Brianna, what was that experience like, knowing you were making history?
It was exciting. It was very powerful. I had my family there, my adopted family from San Francisco, and a lot of my trans and gender non-conforming friends in the audience. And there was a lot of feelings going on, anxiety and excitement, and just, I knew at that moment that it was a special moment, and I'm just very grateful that they asked me to perform the national anthem.
And now you're blazing trails in opera, which is hard enough, Chloe, to break into as it is. Give us a sense of what you learned about what it takes to make it in the opera.
Well, as you said, Nina, it's an extremely high-bound industry in a lot of ways, and it's not a diverse profession at all, actually. It's not just about a lack of diversity when it comes to gender. There's a lack of diversity when it comes to race and other things like that. So it's very, very hard for anyone to break in. There are now a couple of singers who are really starting to make it to the upper echelons. People like Lucia Lucas. She is a baritone, and she's making her debut with the English National Opera in October.
So she is a baritone, so she maintained her baritone sound when she made the transition.
She did.
Brianna, I want to get into your personal story a little bit more, because even before you tried to break into opera, you had a life that was full of challenges. Talk to us a little bit about what it was like for you, even very early on, when your father didn't accept your sexuality.
So it was very difficult. My youth was very difficult, my youth. And, my father just did not agree with me associating myself with the arts. And he thought that me being an artist was a result of being gay. And it was very hard. And he abused me plenty of times because he felt as if me being an artist was it was just totally out of line with his beliefs as a pastor. So
what's incredible is there was a part of you, though, that still knew deep inside that you had a voice that needed to be heard, that moved people.
Yeah, and Janet Mock, she's a trans activist and journalist, and she said something very poignant, and she said that when she discovered who she was very young, it was her first conviction. And at the age of 5, that was my very first conviction. It sounds cliche, but at the age of 5, my mind and my body did not fit. And so I had to deal with that mental and emotional struggle that even my family didn't understand and my father didn't understand. And so I think when I tried to express myself, my father kind of pushed me back, and, he would, beat me a lot, because he felt as if beating the gay away was the way, but it wasn't a gay issue, it was more of a gender issue. And I think the world has to understand the difference between sexuality and gender, and I was dealing with the gender issue.
When did you decide to begin your physical transition?
I decided at 19, and it was a very monumental moment because actually I met a trans male at my college at the California Institute of the Arts, and his name is Keen, and I didn't know that he was trans until we had a conversation at a college party. And so he introduced me to his doctor in Van Nuys, California, and then I just started my transition from there. And it was a very intense process, lots of therapy. Gratefully I went to a school that therapists and teachers supported me. But the voice department had an issue with that at CalArts. And I remember when I decided that I wanted to sing soprano, my teacher said, no, you can't do that at the end of your final year at CalArts. You cannot do that. I said, no, I will do that, because I do not fit this whole tenor persona or visual that they want me to be. And so that was something that I had to fight with. And I had so many close friends at CalArts that kind of pushed me and actually push the teachers to allow me to be who I am. So I'm very thankful for the support.
And now, Chloe, going through a physical transition, there's also hormones associated with that. Estrogen doesn't change the voice. So Brianna's ability to hit those high notes is a result of her hard work. But you met somebody who did take testosterone knowing that it would lower their voice, right?
That's right, Nina. One of the three subjects in my documentary is Elliot Franks, who was one of the Bay Area's go-to sopranos. Glorious soprano voice, singing all over the place with some of the really best-known companies here. And at the age of 50, Elliot made the difficult decision to begin taking testosterone, knowing that it could really interfere with his career. It was a huge risk. But he did it because he needed to for himself. And he also very courageously documented his process, or allowed his process to be documented. So you can actually hear his voice changing in my documentary. But as a result of going through this process, he did lose his career as a professional opera singer.
You mentioned early on that diversity is an issue in opera. Do you see that changing, whether it be more transgender singers or even more African-American, Latino, or Asian women in lead roles?
Well, it's starting to happen a little bit more. In San Francisco, for example, we recently had Janae Bridges playing the role of Carmen. And the San Francisco Opera has started a department of diversity and inclusivity, though that effort is more geared towards broadening audiences than it is at the moment towards broadening the production team and talent on stage.
Well, Brianna Sinclair, tell us where we can see and hear you next.
Yes, so I am singing for the Equality California Palm Spring Awards, October 20th. And also I make my opera debut in Toronto, Canada, April 17th through the 25th. And the opera's called Bound by Kevin Lau, and he's a composer. And it's, about, the dehumanization of folks in a corrupt government. So I'm very excited to play Kelly Davidson in the opera. So.
Well, congratulations to you. And thank you for sharing your story. And Chloe, thank you for sharing these stories. It was so great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Mia.
Yes, thank you, Nina.
That'll do it for us. You can hear Chloe's KQED radio documentary on transgender opera singers at californiareport.org. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Nina Kuhn. Thanks for joining us.